This story is fictional and for entertainment only. Any resemblance to real events is dramatized. She entered without fanfare, no crowd of supporters, no dramatic entrance, no dark glasses, just an ordinary woman wearing a fitted dark blue jacket. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her gaze focused straight ahead. Initially, most people didn't know who she was. After all, Norah Jones had made her reputation by avoiding scandals, staying out of the news, and keeping away from drama. But that morning, inside the imposing wood-paneled courtroom in central Manhattan, her simple presence felt like a whisper that suddenly became a shout. People began murmuring in shock. Was that really her? The same woman who performed heartfelt songs and earned numerous Grammy Awards. The same musician who had been called the voice of calm during the troubled early 2000s. What brought her here to Diddy's trial? The judge looked up. Even he appeared momentarily surprised. But when her name was called, Miss Norah Jones, please come to the witness stand, everything went silent. Diddy, sitting next to his lawyers, stayed perfectly still. No movement, no reaction. Just an icy stare as Norah crossed the room, put her right hand on the Bible, and promised to tell the truth. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted completely. You see, until this point, the case had been filled with industry insiders, assistants, former workers, security staff, models, and music producers. But Norah Jones didn't fit into that circle, at least not openly. That's what made her appearance so electric. She wasn't just another witness, she was an unknown factor, an artist the public believed in. Her reputation was clean, her image perfect. So why was she here now? Before we continue with this amazing story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell.
Ow!
This way, you won't miss another compelling documentary like this one. Now let's continue. She adjusted the microphone slightly. The courtroom became completely quiet. Even the distant sound of the air conditioning seemed loud. A legal aide was writing nervously. The main prosecutor leaned in closer, and a woman in the back row put her hand over her mouth. Norah looked straight forward, not at Diddy, not at the jury, but at something far away, as if searching for the right words in a distant memory. I was advised not to come forward, she started quietly. But staying silent in this situation would have made me part of the problem. A shared breath echoed through the room. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, but everyone could sense it. Something important. The odd thing was, she wasn't mad, she wasn't upset, she wasn't trembling. She was composed, strangely composed. Her voice was steady, her hands motionless, but the importance of what she was about to reveal was already weighing on everyone in that courtroom. And Diddy, for the first time in days, looked away. I met him once, Norah continued, her voice carrying across the courtroom like the slow approach of a storm. But once was more than enough. It felt as if all the air in the room had been removed and replaced with a single question. What happened during that one meeting? Why would Norah Jones, a woman famous for her quiet nature and peace, feel forced to stand here now, facing flashing cameras and a man whose empire was at risk? She didn't look at Diddy once. Her eyes moved instead to the wood grain of the witness box, following invisible patterns as if anchoring herself with each word. It was a dinner, she said. It's one of those industry gatherings you can't refuse. You smile, shake hands, pose for photos. You endure it. As the prosecutor stepped back, letting her speak without interruption. There was music, champagne, introductions. He was charming, very charming. Said he'd always respected my work, said I was different from the others, that I had grace. I remember that word clearly, grace. Her hands now rested gently in her lap, fingers linked together. But then his tone shifted, subtle but sharp. He asked if I ever felt restricted, like I'd created a prison of respectability around myself. He said you could be powerful, Norah, but you're too scared to break free. A quiet rustling of paper from a reporter in the back was the only sound. He offered me something, she said, pausing. Everyone leaned forward. He called it an opportunity. A partnership not in music, not in art, but in influence. He said there were places where the real decisions were made, rooms I'd never enter without him. He said he could open doors that would never open for a quiet girl with a piano. A hint of bitterness crossed her face. I said no. That's when everything changed. The charm disappeared. She paused again, breathing in deeply. He told me I'd regret it, that playing small was a choice, and weak people made it. And then he leaned in and said something I've never repeated until today. The room felt like it was closing in on itself. No one dared cough. No one moved their chair. He said everyone's owned by someone, Norah. You just haven't realized who owns you yet. Gasps filled the air. Even the court reporter froze for half a second, her fingers stopping mid-stroke. Norah looked up now, directly at the jury. Her voice didn't shake. That night, I walked out of that dinner, and I told myself I'd never speak of it, not because I was afraid, but because I thought it didn't matter. He didn't touch me. He didn't yell. It wasn't illegal, just ugly. She folded her hands once more. Now I see it was the same strategy he used with others, the same pattern. Charm, offer control. Only difference was I said no, and others didn't get that choice. In that moment, the silence in the courtroom wasn't just respect, it was mourning. Mourning the realization that power doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like a smile with a contract hidden underneath, and still. Diddy didn't look up. The judge shifted slightly in his chair, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Even he seemed caught in the weight of what had just been said. Norah's words hadn't been loud, but they echoed every word heavy with the kind of truth that stings long after it's spoken. The lead defense attorney stood, adjusting his jacket, preparing to question her. He walked slowly, carefully toward the stand, as if hoping each step would somehow reduce the power in the room. His voice, when it came, was smooth and controlled. "Miss Jones," he said, "thank you for being here. But I must ask, are you saying that my client threatened you?" Norah tilted her head slightly, not in confusion but in clarity. "I'm saying he tried to rewrite the story of who I was. He tried to convince me that peace was weakness, that silence meant giving up, that kindness was a flaw. And when I rejected that story, he called it a mistake." The attorney nodded, trying to keep his composure. "But he never physically harmed you?" "No," she replied. "But harm isn't always physical. Sometimes harm is a seed planted in your identity, a seed that grows into self-doubt, shame, fear, and that can last longer than bruises." A murmur rippled through the gallery. He pressed on. "Do you have any evidence that Mr. Combs ever forced or manipulated others?" Norah didn't hesitate. "That's not why I'm here. I'm not the prosecution. Not a lawyer. I'm here because I was told this was a place for truth, and my truth has value, even if it's inconvenient." For a moment, he looked cornered. Then he changed his approach. "You're a respected artist, Miss Jones, award-winning, beloved by the public. Don't you think speaking here today could influence others unfairly, tip the scales?" She leaned forward just slightly, her voice even softer now. "You say that as if I asked for this, as if I wanted the cameras, the questions, the headlines. I didn't. I've stayed silent for over 10 years because I didn't want any of this. But staying silent meant protecting him, and I won't do that anymore." There was no applause, no reaction, but the energy in the room was unmistakable. Something fundamental had shifted. The attorney glanced down at his notes. Perhaps realizing there was nothing more he could say without sounding cruel, he turned to the judge and gave a subtle nod. No further questions. As he returned to his seat, Norah remained still, unshaken, but everyone could sense it. Beneath her stillness was fire. Not rage, not revenge, something deeper. The fire of someone who had once been told to shrink and instead chose to speak. The judge turned to her. "You may step down, Strisk." Norah stood, but he glanced at her just for a second, and in that second, something flickered across his face. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was recognition, because for the first time in this trial, someone hadn't accused him of an act. They had described the system and how he thrived within it. And that kind of truth is harder to question. As Norah exited through the heavy wooden doors, a whisper rose in the courtroom, one that no one dared speak aloud, but everyone felt. If Norah Jones is testifying, who else is coming next? The courtroom didn't return to normal after Norah left, It couldn't. Even with the next witness being called, there was an invisible residue in the air, like the smell of smoke after a fire. The jury shifted in their seats, clearly still thinking about what they had just heard. Court reporters whispered to each other quickly, comparing notes. But it wasn't just about Norah's presence. It was the tone she brought. Controlled, poised. And yet beneath every calm word was a dagger aimed at something deeper than just one man. The prosecution didn't rush the moment. It let it breathe, let the tension hang. And when they stood again, they didn't go for theatrics. They played their next move with precision. They introduced a silent video clip. No audio, just grainy. Time-stamped footage of an after-party in 2017, VIP only. A room filled with celebrities, agents, and security. And near the center, Diddy talking, smiling, whispering something into Norah's ear. The jury watched closely. There was no context, no sound, just body language. She didn't smile back. Stepped away, and he followed. The prosecutor paused the footage, then addressed the jury. You've heard the testimony. I'll see the moment. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it wasn't nothing either. It was enough to raise questions. Why had she kept that moment to herself for so long? Why reveal it now? And what exactly was said in that exchange? That's when things shifted again. The next witness was a talent manager, not a celebrity, not a household name, but someone who had been in the industry for 2 decades. Someone who had seen things. He testified under oath that he had witnessed that exact encounter, that he saw Norah leave early that night, visibly shaken, and that she told him quietly, "I'm never doing one of his events again." But it wasn't just that moment. He described a pattern. One by one, he isolated them, the manager said. Not just artists, people with voices, people who could speak against him. He didn't always threaten them. Sometimes he offered them the world, and when they refused, he made sure their phone didn't ring for months. The courtroom shifted again. This wasn't just about Norah anymore. It was about reach, influence, a network of silence built not on fear alone, but on power, on favor, on gatekeeping. The defense objected. Speculation, they argued. Sustained, the judge said, but the words had already landed. Because sometimes truth doesn't need permission to settle in people's minds. Then came something no one expected. The prosecutor pulled out a handwritten letter, folded, fragile, dated 2018. This letter, he said, was written by Norah Jones. It was never published, never mailed. It was found in her personal notebook, shared voluntarily with this court. He unfolded it carefully and began to read. I've seen how silence serves the powerful, how kindness is mistaken for submission. I've walked away from rooms that made me feel like a ghost, but I will not walk away from myself anymore. Even the court's stenographer had to pause for a breath. The letter ended with a line that now seemed prophetic. One day this will matter. Even if no one listens, it will matter to me. And now, finally, people were listening. Diddy sat motionless, but his jaw was tight, his hands clasped. The mask of indifference was no longer perfect, because the truth wasn't coming for him in one punch. It was arriving in 1,000 tiny cuts. And the jury, they were bleeding with it. The courtroom reconvened after a short break, but no one had truly left the moment. Even the hallway outside was buzzing with quiet murmurs, reporters on their phones, sketch artists flipping through pages, court officers exchanging glances that said, "Did you expect that?" Everyone knew something had shifted, not in the law, but in the narrative. When court was back in session, the judge returned with a composed expression, but his eyes showed it. He was following every detail now. Like the rest of them, the prosecution stood slower this time, measured, strategic. Your Honor, at this time we'd like to enter into evidence a series of phone records, 5 calls between Norah Jones and an unlisted number registered to Mr. Combs's studio, spanning from 2017 to 2019. The defense objected again. Relevance? But the judge overruled. The prosecution continued. The content of these calls isn't recorded. The timing right after public interviews, red carpet appearances, and album announcements raises a question, a pattern, a presence. The jury leaned forward because patterns tell stories, when people can't. And then came the testimony of a second surprise witness, a former house assistant, anonymous in name but not in detail. A young woman, early 30s, soft-spoken but firm. She spoke under protection, her voice shaking but determined. "I remember Norah," she said. "She came to the studio once, didn't stay long, looked uncomfortable, and after she left, he wasn't." "Happy?" the prosecutor asked. "Did he say anything specific?" She nodded. "He said she wasn't useful, said she didn't get it, that she was wasting the opportunity. Then he laughed, said she'd learn the hard way how the world really worked." The courtroom chilled. Then came something even colder. The assistant pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a photocopy of an email she had once been asked to delete. Sent from an internal account. Subject line, silent list. The body of the email, a spreadsheet of names. Artists, journalists, executives, a mix of people. But next to each name was a column labeled status. Some were marked ally, some neutral, others non-compliant. And next to Norah's name, one word, frozen. The courtroom murmured again. Prosecutor didn't need to explain it. A whole system of who was allowed to rise and who was silenced. The defense tried to interject, tried to discredit, tried to reroute. But with every new piece, the story grew louder, and Diddy, his calm began to crack. The jaw tension turned into clenched fists. His lawyer whispered something, but he waved him off. Eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. Then, just when everyone thought the moment had reached its peak, the prosecution played a voicemail. A woman's voice, unidentified. "I got the call. I know what it means. If I speak, they'll bury my career. I'm not Norah. I can't afford to disappear. I have rent. I have kids. I'm sorry. I'm out." It wasn't proof of a crime, but it was undeniable. Evidence of fear. Fear layered enough becomes control. By now, the jury wasn't just listening. They were feeling, because this trial wasn't only about what happened behind closed doors. It was about how those doors were built in the first place, built to protect the powerful and keep everyone else silent. By the time court resumed the next morning, the world outside had caught up with what was happening inside. News outlets replayed Norah's testimony and reenactments. Social media was flooded with clips from legal analysts dissecting every moment, and trending above all else was one phrase: "Everyone's owned by someone." Inside the courtroom, however, things were far less theatrical. The gravity had settled. The judge looked sterner, the defense team more calculated, and the gallery quieter, as if they all knew that something irreversible had happened. But the prosecution wasn't done. They now turned to testimony that would thread everything together, not through spectacle, but structure. A former tour accountant, Mark Levin, was sworn in. Mid-40s clean-cut, carrying years of experience in balancing multi-million-dollar budgets for some of the biggest names in music. He wasn't there for drama. He was there with receipts. He explained how Diddy's empire wasn't just musical. It was managerial. Dozens of shell companies, unregistered production subsidiaries, exclusive contracts that artists weren't allowed to speak about publicly. There was a reward system, he said. You stayed close, you got gigs. You pushed back, you vanished. The prosecution showed emails, not explicit threats, but messages laced with innuendo. Things like, "Not the right image for the brand," might. "Want to chill for a bit? Radio silence might be your best move right now. Let's revisit this when your loyalty is clearer." One of those emails was sent to Norah's agent shortly after that message. Norah's planned collaboration with a high-profile producer was mysteriously shelved. European tour leg was canceled without notice. Her name disappeared from a festival lineup she had already signed for. When asked if she ever protested publicly, agents said, "No, because in this industry, you don't protest, you disappear." There was something deeply chilling about how calm the witness was, because this wasn't some big conspiracy theory. It was paperwork, schedules, sign-offs, contracts, all threaded together with invisible strings pulled tight from the top. And then, just when things began to feel too procedural, came the most unexpected twist yet. A name was read aloud in court, not Norah, not another victim, collaborator. Someone who had worked closely with Diddy for over a decade. Someone with clout. Someone who, until now, had been quiet. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked singer-songwriter Maxwell. Gasps echoed before the judge could even bang his gavel. He was dressed simply, black suit, no tie. Didn't make eye contact with anyone. Just made his way to the stand and took a breath so long it sounded like he was preparing for war. And then he spoke. Let me be clear. I owe a lot to Sean. He gave me opportunities early in my career that helped shape who I am. But part of why I'm here is because I can't ignore what I saw and what I allowed myself to be silent about. The room froze. He continued. I was there the night Norah left that event. I saw how uncomfortable she was, and I saw how Diddy responded behind closed doors. The language, the dismissal, the strategy. It was always a game of pressure and presence. You don't need to hit someone to leave a bruise. It wasn't betrayal, it was truth. And it landed like a gut punch, because Maxwell wasn't a victim. He was a witness to how it all worked. Sometimes we help build the very walls people felt trapped in, he said. And we didn't realize it until it was too late. The courtroom was silent again, because now the narrative had evolved. This wasn't just about Norah's courage. It was about the silent network of cooperation. The people who had watched stayed quiet, benefited, and were finally willing to admit. Silence wasn't just complicity. It was currency. Maxwell's testimony didn't just deepen the case. It cracked it wide open. When he left the witness stand, he didn't return to the gallery. He walked straight out of the courtroom, head lowered, hands in his pockets. Like a man who had just laid down a burden he'd carried for years. And maybe he had. The prosecution let the silence linger. They understood that the weight of what had just been said needed air to settle. The jury didn't look away. Some of them had notebooks in front of them, but weren't writing. They were listening now, not just as jurors, but as human beings. And then, almost quietly, came the next name, stylist. Unfamous, unassuming, but she had been in the rooms behind the cameras and the shadows. She worked for Norah on and off over several years. What she brought with her wasn't drama, it was detail. I saw how things changed, she said. At first, Norah was always booked, always moving, always respected. Then suddenly, she was too difficult to mature, to off-brand. Nothing changed about her, but people's attitudes did. People who used to chase her down for events suddenly wouldn't return our calls. She paused. They didn't blacklist her, that's too obvious. They slow-faded her. That's how this world works. The prosecutor asked if she ever heard Norah mention Diddy by name. The stylist hesitated, then nodded. Yes, once. She said he didn't have to touch me to silence me. All he had to do was remove the music. The quote hit like a stone dropped. Into still water, remove the music. What does that mean to someone like Norah Jones? Music wasn't just her career, it was her identity, her truth. To remove it was to erase her. The courtroom grew colder. And still Diddy remained seated, stoic, but pale. Because the trial wasn't painting him as a villain with one terrible act. It was painting him as the architect of an environment, a climate.
Ow.
One that slowly bent people into silence without ever needing to raise his voice. The prosecution, then, shifted direction. They called an entertainment attorney to the stand, clean-shaven, glasses, briefcase full of files. He wasn't there for emotion. He was there for contracts. He began to outline the fine print of NDAs. Signed by several former employees and collaborators, contracts that barred not just public statements, but private conversations about brand-sensitive interactions. Buried within the pages were clauses so broad they could be used to intimidate anyone who spoke up, even casually. And then came the one linked to Norah. Clause 7.4, he read aloud. The client agrees to refrain from statements, written or verbal, which could be interpreted as diminishing the value brand, or a professional reputation of Mr. Combs or any of his affiliated business entities. The prosecutor asked, was this contract ever signed by Norah Jones? No, the lawyer replied. She refused. But her agent was contacted 3 times, and in one email, Mr. Combs's team wrote, "Without her cooperation, we may need to reconsider our joint opportunities moving forward." And that was it. The paper trail. The polite threat. The smile with teeth. Because the worst kind of silence doesn't come from being shouted down. It comes from being systematically erased. The attorney finished with a final line. "In my 20 years of working in entertainment law, I've seen 2 kinds of contracts. The ones that protect talent and the ones that protect power. This was the second kind." The jury looked exhausted, not because they were bored, but because they were beginning to understand. This wasn't about whether Norah Jones had suffered something obvious. It was about whether her story exposed something bigger, something systemic. Something that didn't look evil at first glance because it wore designer suits and shook hands with presidents. The prosecution ended that day with a statement, "We are not here to prove that Miss Jones was assaulted. We are here to prove that her truth was suppressed, that she was labeled and managed like a product, and that when she refused to play along, the machinery of power turned against her, quietly, completely." The courtroom recessed for the day, and outside, waiting beneath the gray sky, were a growing number of supporters, some holding signs, some just holding phones capturing the moment. And inside, Diddy sat alone at the defense table, not speaking, not moving. Because with every word that echoed through that courtroom, the question became harder to escape. What do you do when the silence speaks louder than any accusation ever could? The next morning, something felt different. The courtroom filled up. Faster than usual, reporters arrived earlier. Yet the security presence doubled, and the seats reserved for the public overflowed with new faces. Musicians, activists, industry veterans, and even a few retired judges. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, like everyone knew that the trial had crossed some invisible line. It was no longer just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning. And in the middle of it all, Diddy sat still, surrounded by his legal team, but very much alone. The once cocky persona had dulled. No nods, no glances, just eyes forward, face rigid, as if bracing for a wave that was already crashing. Today's witness was introduced simply as Alex, pseudonym approved by the court, a former executive assistant who worked for one of Diddy's top-level private companies for 4 years. She entered with a face blurred by privacy measures, her voice altered through a filter. But her testimony cut sharper than anything before it. "I wasn't a victim, not in the way people think," she said. "But I witnessed the manufacturing of silence. I witnessed the way people like Norah were discussed in back rooms, on speakerphones and emails that were marked confidential, but everyone had access to." She described meetings that weren't about music but about control. How do we spin this? Who do we call to cancel that interview? Which blog can we leak a fake story to? That's how the game worked. She spoke of a conversation that haunted her. "There was a moment I'll never forget," she said, voice steady. "I asked why we were going after someone who had said nothing publicly, just moved on, no drama. And I was told, sometimes you punish the quiet ones harder. They're the ones people believe." Gasps didn't come as much anymore in this trial. People were past shock now. Reactions were quieter, eyes narrowing, breaths held, kind of stunned understanding that this wasn't about one person. It was about an entire way of operating. Alex handed over a document, an internal memo, a list of names with notes beside them. Strategies. It read like a playbook next to Norah's name. Starve the spotlight. Let her fade. The prosecutor read those 4 words aloud slowly, letting them linger. Starve the spotlight. Because to erase someone publicly, you don't need to accuse them, you just stop calling, stop booking, stop playing their music. Not one loud door slammed shut, but 100 silent ones never opened again. Then Alex added something that changed the room's temperature completely. She wasn't the only one, and she listed them carefully, one after another, some names known, others not. Artists, writers, advocates, all of them quiet. All of them quietly removed. "But here's what hit hardest," she said. "We didn't blacklist them because they were dangerous. We blacklisted them because they reminded us of the limits of control. You can pressure, you can buy, you can scare. but someone who walks away without explanation that terrifies people like him? The judge paused. For the first time, even he looked like he needed a moment. When court resumed, the defense team made a last-ditch move. They tried to introduce a character witness, a longtime collaborator prepared to speak about Diddy's philanthropy, his mentorship, the artists he elevated. But the prosecution was ready. They pulled up an old interview transcript, one where that same witness had once said, off record, "There are two Diddys, the genius and the ghost. One builds you up, the other erases you. If you say no," the defense went quiet, and then the moment everyone had been waiting for finally came. The court clerk stood and announced, "We will now allow a readout from Norah Jones' official statement to the court, submitted in full transparency for the record." The courtroom stood still. Prosecutor unfolded the document and began. "To the court and to anyone still listening, I never wanted this spotlight. I only wanted peace. But peace can't come at the cost of hiding what was done in the shadows. I'm not here to punish. I'm here to say this happened. It happens, and it must be seen." The words hung like sacred truth in the air, searing, final. When it was over, the courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't move. It absorbed, because what began as a trial about Diddy had become a mirror reflecting an industry, a culture, a hierarchy built on fear and silence and selective praise. And when court adjourned for the day, no one spoke right away. Because for the first time in the trial, they weren't just asking what would happen to Diddy. They were asking what this trial revealed about everyone else. It had been 9 days of testimony, 9 days of faces, some known, some forgotten, returning to the center of a national conversation they never asked to be part of. 9 days of whispers that had once circled through green rooms, elevators, and back office phone calls. Now spoken aloud under oath, and through it all, the one name that lingered in every breath was Norah Jones. Outside the courthouse, crowds grew larger. Some held signs with quotes from her testimony. Others came simply to watch history unfold. Inside, though, it wasn't chaos. It was a silence made of gravity, of the collective weight of so many truths. Finally rising through years of quiet denial, today, the defense would make one final move. Diddy's legal team, up until now reactive and careful, had decided to take a risk. They were calling Diddy himself to the stand. The room tensed as he stood. In a black tailored suit, his expression unreadable. He approached the witness box, raised his hand, swore the oath, and sat, legs crossed, out fingers interlaced. His lawyer began gently. "Mr. Combs, you've heard the allegations, you've heard the stories. How do you respond?" Diddy took a long breath. "I never told anyone to hurt Norah Jones. I never told anyone to blacklist her. If people made decisions to distance themselves, that was their choice. I've built my empire by knowing who to align with and who to walk away from. There it was. Not a denial, not really. Just distance." The lawyer nodded. "Were you aware of the term silent list?" Diddy gave a tight smile. "I don't micromanage everything. I have people. Someone made a list. I don't recall seeing it. But every brand has its image, and protecting that image sometimes means making hard decisions." Prosecutor stood. "Mr. Combs, did you say to Norah Jones in 2017, everyone's owned by someone?" Diddy leaned back. His smile faded. "I don't remember saying that, but it sounds like something someone might say at a party, off the cuff. I didn't mean anything. Buy it." The room held its breath. "Do you believe people like Norah should have been removed from festival lineups, collaborations, radio rotations, simply for declining to work with you?" Diddy's tone sharpened. "I believe loyalty is currency. Believe relationships are everything in this industry. You're either building together or walking away. And if you walk away from me, you're walking away from a lot of doors. Gasps, real ones." The prosecutor stepped forward. "So you're confirming the machinery of exclusion? You're confirming what every witness has said, that those who walk away are erased?" "No," Diddy replied. "I'm saying I move with people who move with me. That's not exclusion, that's business." But the courtroom wasn't buying it. Not anymore, because the language of control doesn't always scream, it smiles. It was a masterclass in deflection, polished, strategic, every phrase technically safe. But every sentence confirmed the very power dynamics the trial had exposed. Then came the final blow. Not from Diddy, but from the prosecution. They played a clip, an old interview, unreleased, found in archive footage. Diddy in a studio, joking off camera, unaware he was still being recorded. She said, "No, that's cool. But don't act surprised when the world stops calling. We don't chase ghosts." And the room went still. The ghost, that's what Norah had become. Publicly shamed, not attacked, just erased. And the man responsible had just confirmed it with a smirk and a shrug. Diddy's lawyer tried to interject context, but it didn't matter, because the context was already clear. The trial wasn't just about legality, it was about legacy. In Diddy's words had already carved his into stone. The judge adjourned for the day.
The jury would return tomorrow for deliberation.
Outside, rain had begun to fall. People stood under umbrellas, faces lifted toward the courthouse windows as if waiting for the truth itself to look down at them. Inside, Norah Jones was nowhere to be seen. But her voice was everywhere, not echoing, not fading, standing. The final day arrived with a hush that blanketed everything. No more press conferences, no more witness surprises, no more statements echoing through the marble hallways. Just 12. Jurors seated quietly, each carrying the weight of a story much larger than one trial. One celebrity, or even one verdict. Subscribe for more videos.